but all over this country, people are feeling in unease. Something bad is happening, and they don't quite understand what it's about. And what I would like to do this hour, Mr. Speaker, with the help of some of my colleagues, is to perhaps try to explain to the working people of America, to the middle-income people of America, perhaps some of the reasons why people are angry, why people are frustrated, and then maybe make some suggestions as to how we can develop public policy which will improve life for all of our people. Mr. Speaker, let me begin by quoting from I think, very important article that appeared on the front page of the New York Times on Monday, April 16th, just a couple of weeks ago. And what it says is that the United States of America today has by far the most unequal distribution of wealth in the entire industrialized world. And the article says that, quote, recent studies show that rather than being an egalitarian society, the United States has become the most economically stratified of industrialized nations. Even class societies like Britain, which inherited large differences in income and wealth over centuries going back to their feudal pasts, now have greater economic equality than in the United States. And then the article goes on to say, quote, Federal Reserve figures from 1989, the most recent available, show that the wealthiest 1% of American households with net worth of at least $2.3 million each owns nearly 40% of the nation's wealth. And that, end of quote. And that contrast in Britain, where the richest 1% only own 18% of the wealth. So in other words, we are now living in a country in which the richest 1% own 40% of the wealth, which is more wealth than the bottom 90%. Rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer, the middle class is shrinking. And I think that explains, or begins to explain, why it is that American people, and especially working people, the middle-income people, are feeling very, very anxious. Because the bottom line is, and we don't talk about that too much here. Democrats don't talk about it. Republicans don't talk about it. Rush Limbaugh somehow forgets to talk about it. But the reality is that since 1973, 4/5, 80% of American workers have experienced falling or stagnant real incomes. Now, what does that mean? That means that the last 22 years, American people are working very, very hard. In many instances, they are working longer hours. In fact, a study came out recently, if you can believe this, that in order to compensate for the falling wages that American workers are now receiving, workers are now working an extra 1 month a year. In my own state of Vermont, it is certainly not uncommon for workers to be working not one job, not two jobs, but on occasion 3 jobs. Since 1973, for production workers, there has been a 20% decline in real wages. There has been an increase in poverty. For low-wage workers, workers who just have a high school degree, don't have any college, the drop in entry-level jobs has been precipitous. For young male workers, there has been a 30% decline in entry-level wages for young men graduating high school, going into the workforce. For young women, the drop has been 18%. There was an interesting article which I think typifies much of what's happening in this country appeared in the Wall Street Journal some months ago, and they said the good news is that in the Midwest, many of the factories that had been closed in the 1980s are now reopened. Workers are now going back to work in the factories. That's the good news. The bad news is that those workers, same workers, going back to the same factories at wages which are paying them 50 to 60 to 70% of what they made 10 or 12 years before.